too. She's a co-author right there as well, and I'm also a co-author on this paper. And this is what we kind of consider the global inventory of where we are now in those various different land classifications that Professor Woodley mentioned. And we landed on 50.4% of the, and this is looking at terrestrial, in natural conditions supportive of biodiversity habitat. And I'm not going to, I won't break it down into too much detail, but that actually was a finding of that paper in 2020. We're now rerunning this actually at a very high resolution. And the initial studies are showing that we're quite below 50. So probably will be something like 47 in the paper, but that'll come out next year. We'll see. So as you guys all know, a Living Planet report, which some people now like to call the Dying Planet report, has now been updated to 69% loss since I was born, about 50 years ago. And that has happened concurrently with about a loss of a quarter of all of natural lands. And this is in the Americas. So we know there's a direct correlation between land conversion and dramatic species decline. So that's why we do need this area target. And I'm not going to go into the ecoregions, but as Professor Woodley mentioned, there's a lot of ecoregion by 844 ecoregions. The ecoregions with the most species have 50 or higher protected and conserved. Motion 101 we mentioned, the scientific consensus, which I was shocked actually when that ended up in the climate text. So the IPCC, I don't know if there's climate folks here as well, but the IPCC is a scientist body that advises the Climate Convention. And in their second assessment, so there's 3 reports that came out to inform the big Climate Convention. There's this amazing quote there, which I just should read because we were all a bit gobsmacked when it ended up in the climate text, but the scientific report. Some countries have agreed to conserve 30% of the Earth's land, but conserving half may be necessary to restore the ability of natural ecosystems to cope with the damage wreaked on them. So that was pretty compelling, and there's so clearly consensus amongst climate scientists on this higher target. And the reason for that is because all of these critters that we love so much are intimately involved in the global carbon cycle. And that is an epiphany that a lot of people have not yet woken up to, and I hope in the next 5 years this is going to be a lot of the focus of the research we support, is how do like beavers and tigers and otters and tapirs and toucans, how are they involved in the climate cycle? And so we know that about a quarter of all human-caused climate emissions are absorbed by natural ecosystems on land, another quarter roughly in oceans. And that's through a process called a trophic cascade, one of the ways where it's essentially the web of life and predation. One minor example might be, well, it's not minor, but forest elephants knock down trees, eat the low-hanging stuff that actually causes more carbon to be sucked out of the atmosphere. So that's the second reason, the climate reason. The third one is human rights, as has been mentioned earlier. That they're, tragically, indigenous people and local communities collectively probably govern about half of the planet, close to it, and only 20% of that is recognized. And so there's a big push for land tenure rights coming. Most of a great deal, 40% roughly, of the biologically important land is governed by indigenous people. So I put together this little chart which shows that, this is based on Territories of Life report which came out last year, that when you add 17% of protected areas with the conservation, de facto conservation areas, so highly biologically intact lands that are governed by indigenous people, but which aren't necessarily designated. There is an overlap there in the middle, that's called an ICCA. But when you combine that together, we're essentially already protecting about 34% of the planet when you acknowledge the full land tenure of indigenous people. So we're kind of already over 30, we're really at 34. And that extra 16% up there is unprotected land that's not on indigenous territories. So adding all that together, we get to 15. And we found a lot of literature has shown that the indigenous lands are extremely effective. These are 3 countries in Latin America at reducing deforestation rates. This is a recent paper. Last reason a lot of people don't think about is, which we all know, is COVID. We have a public health reason. This little guy is one example of the zoonosis. It's when a disease that's inside of an ecosystem pops out of the ecosystem and gets into humans or other animals. And there's a new research out that shows that intact or wilderness areas that have a high ecosystem function are better at keeping those viruses inside and not spilling over to human populations. So I think I have a whole thing on myths around 3030, but I think we can save that for the Q&A. But I think that gives you a good taste of the 4 reasons we see we should be striving for good.
Thank you so much, Carl. Okay, so up next, I would like to call Erin Drage, who is the program officer of the WCPA and also the lead of the Young Professionals Network of WCPA. Erin? Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much. So we're going to stick with the technical side of things for now, and then I think we're getting into some more exciting storytelling and land-based local stories that we'll be hearing. For now, I'm going to talk a little bit about OECMs. If anybody loves acronyms, this presentation is for you. This is really the technical side of how we can get to half, because, is there a clicker somewhere? Oh yeah, sorry, thank you. Because we, over at the World Commission on Protected Areas, and generally in this forum in CBD COP15, we tend to really like protected areas for a lot of reasons. They're a proven way to protect biodiversity, but they're not the only way that we're going to achieve 50% protection or 30% protection or any area-based conservation target within the global biodiversity framework. What we also need are other tools to recognize the amazing conservation efforts that are going on around the world already, and to encourage governments, the private sector, local communities to engage in biodiversity conservation. So OECMs, it might be an acronym you've heard in the past. Despite what you might think, we didn't, in the global conservation community, we didn't think that OECMs was the sexiest name we could come up with for these other conservation measures. It actually came directly from Aichi Target 11. So those of you, Stephen was mentioning earlier Target 3, this idea of 30 by 30. It's taken up a lot of space in public discourse recently. Aichi Target 11 is its predecessor from the last Global Biodiversity Framework. And this line, well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, was put in specifically to say it can't only be legally designated protected areas that count towards these area-based targets. This is all good. However, when this target was adopted, it was a very precisely negotiated set of words and this language that was used, but we didn't yet have a definition of OECMs. So once this target was adopted in 2010, a years-long process of defining OECMs ensued, which IUCN WCPA was heavily involved in. In 2018 at COP14, they finally adopted the official definition of OECMs, and we released our technical report on OECMs that goes into much more detail on this in 2019. So because so much time and effort was put into defining OECMs, I'm actually just going to read out the official definition. An OECM is a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in-situ conservation of biodiversity, with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. So you'd think with a definition that long, there might be some kind of common understanding of what an OECM is, but turns out there's a lot more nuance behind an OECM. And any of you who are familiar with designating and accounting for protected areas in OECMs know that there are a lot of potential risks and pitfalls with this designation. There are a lot of ways that governments, private companies, even local communities want to use OECMs to potentially make it seem like they're doing more for biodiversity conservation than they actually are. So WCPA and many partners have gone through the process of helping to clarify what counts towards OECMs and what does not. One of the first questions that tends to come up is what's the core difference between a protected area and an OECM? That one we actually have a simple answer for, where a protected area, it needs to have a primary conservation objective, and this is reflected in most legal structures in most jurisdictions around the world. An OECM, in contrast, needs to deliver effective and long-term conservation of biodiversity, but its primary objective does not need to be conservation of biodiversity. When we go through the process of deciding what counts as an OECM and what does not, there's been quite a bit of confusion, and so WCPA has been coming up with key questions to ask, and I've listed, just a couple of the many of questions that go into the process of designating an OECM. And just recently in May of this year, WCPA released a step-by-step process, a tool for local jurisdictions, for private companies, whoever is looking to designate an OECM, a step-by-step process for them to determine whether or not it can be accounted for in the World Database on OECMs. So some of the questions that are really key to ask off the bat are, is there biodiversity in this area that you want to protect? If there's not, it's probably not going to count as an OECM. If it's a protected area, it's also not going to be an OECM. OECMs are by definition not legally protected areas. And so we go through this site-by-site assessment for every OECM that's designated, and it's really important that it's done on a site-by-site case so that we are only accounting for those places that will really contribute to biodiversity conservation. So some examples of what might count as an OECM are Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas, or ICCAs, which we're going to hear about later. There are a number of ICCAs that are already accounted for as OECMs, and that's a really important and empowering opportunity to use OECMs to recognize and celebrate conservation efforts without needing to take away land from Indigenous peoples for legal designations. I won't go through all of them, but watersheds are one that we're seeing come up quite a bit with OECMs, where local and regional governments are already conserving local watersheds for the conservation of clean water for their residents, but they meet all of the other criteria to be designated as OECMs. So there are quite a few examples of what can count. And since we're talking here about the potential for 50% of the land and waters being conserved by 2030, I think it's really important to just quickly talk about the opportunities that OECMs hold for equitable conservation. I think OECMs have been criticized for the pitfalls that I mentioned earlier, the potential for them to be used in harmful ways against local peoples, but we also need to talk about the fact that OECMs present one of the best opportunities we've seen in a long time to engage, to celebrate, and to empower local communities to protect their lands, to conserve biodiversity, very much on their terms, without having to adhere to colonial structures of protected areas. And that's something that OECMs is finally giving local communities the opportunity to do and still be accounted for in a colonial system. It's also really important that we recognize that OECMs, to be recognized, they must adhere to free, prior, and informed consent of local and Indigenous communities, if that's applicable for an OECM, if there are local and Indigenous communities who have an interested stake in that area. So very important that that is a part of OECMs. And finally, I'll just quickly finish off with some of the potential benefits of OECMs. I've touched on many of them already in this very brief introduction to a complex subject, but conserving, supporting, maintaining, enhancing, retaining, connecting, and contributing to ecologically representative and well-connected conservation networks. An OECM is a tool that we're still very much working through. It's yet to be determined how they will play out in real life. There's been a lot of theoretical thinking behind how OECMs will be used, but it's up to us as the conservation community and up to civil society to hold governments and to hold ourselves, to hold companies, to hold local communities accountable to make sure that this very important and exciting tool is used in a way that we want to see it used. So I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of optimism around OECMs, and we just need to make sure that they are used properly. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Erin. Okay, so the last speaker for this, for the first panel discussion is going to be Maggie Fox. She's the former CEO of Climate Reality, and she is the co-founder of the Global Biodiversity Narrative Project. So, Maggie.
Hi, it's nice to meet all of you. I'm going to wear this not just because it's beautiful, but because I was in the march today and I'm still quite cold. Here's my chorus. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a really relative newcomer to this world in one context and in many others not. I've had a long career in climate and purposely left that venue because I thought the climate community had an unfortunately myopic view of the possibility for saving the planet without having biodiversity take a prominent place in the conversation and then actually drive it, as well as that around agricultural land. So I slid into another arena because in both professionally, personally, and spiritually, I think we can't really pull this off without that journey for all of us moving back and forth across the continuum between agricultural uses and biodiversity and climate. And I think Amy asked me to speak today because in that lateral slide between these issues and what I like to fondly call the cascading crises of the 21st century, only 3 of which are the ones we're talking about, is an opportunity for us to actually see who we as human beings are on this planet and how we have caused these changes in ways that require not just exquisite science and brilliant work to work with communities, but also a fundamental and deeply transformative shift in who we think we are. The only people on this planet that have ever fully understood who we are people from the indigenous communities and others whose opportunities to lead the world have been very small, unfortunately, and have left us with marginalizing their lives and now marginalizing ours. And so after I've had a very long and incredibly wonderful career, as I'm sure many of you have, but I wasn't free to step aside because I had reached that point where I could no longer work along the margins of change. It felt to me like we had to go, how did this really happen? How do we do this year after year after year after year? And even now when the crises are stacking us up by the side of the head or kicking us in the gut, we are still turning our attention elsewhere whenever we can find the slightest distraction. I remember a few days ago reading 1,800 brackets in the plan, and I thought, oh, that's quite a distraction from getting to work. Here we have a moment, a clock, after 2 years of not having it, and there are 1,800 brackets in the document that is to be resolved. What does that say? It says we are really flipped around. Because every one of these decisions are very important and really significant. So when I mention 1,800 brackets, it's not in disrespect for the significance or seriousness of each of those decisions, but because they are being used not to move the conversation forward, but to stop it. And so then why? would say at the core of it is this profoundly serious notion that we as human beings are both superior to and separate from all life on this planet. Well, that's just ludicrous. And we've been living for centuries with that ludicrous frame of who we are. So, my dear friend and partner Chelsea found a Brundage and I 12 years ago decided, well, nobody else is really talking about this with the seriousness with which it deserves, so we should start. That's a bit of hubristic, to say the least, because we need a global shift in that conversation. But it has been probably the most gratifying and richest part of my professional journey, which is to realize that all of us know this, but we aren't talking about it. And every time you bring it up in any significant way with someone who feels safe, their heads start nodding, and the recognition of how badly we need to have this conversation appears. And so the door opens, because there's a sense of like, okay, we're going to finally talk about this. But what are we going to do about it? That is more challenging, but first you have to have a conversation. So I would say in the context of this conversation, one of the most important things is to realize that these beautiful acronyms that you've articulated, and there are many, many more, and there's a gazillion more in climate, and now a zillion more growing in the regenerative agriculture space, and all over science and every other discipline. Who have we left out of these conversations? The rest of the world. All of whom, literally all of whom, have to be asked, seduced, loved, and lured into changing the way they think the world works today. And we are not doing that work. We're doing extraordinary science. I remember seeing that Carl, who we've only met through others, it's really nice to see your beautiful smile. I remember seeing that map and feeling this sense of like, oh, there's a picture. And these guys were brilliant enough to create a map that's the whole world. And one in which you can zero it almost into your neighborhood. Which means we, all of us, have a chance to participate in choosing what's protected, all the way to the park that my children played in, or the open space I walk in Boulder, Colorado, some of which could qualify, but that's not why we protect it in the first place. So there's more work to be done in a different way. And so all the conversations are not just here, or in the years it takes to get here, and the work it takes to get here, because most of the most important conversations can actually happen in communities. And that is where the change will shift. That is where the momentum, where 1,800 brackets will not be able to withstand the scrutiny of people who are already doing it, like indigenous communities all over the world. We just have too few people who think they have any say or any sense that it matters to them in any way that they can grasp. And until we do that, we will meet again and again and again and lose more and more and more. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The map is very comforting, but who knows about it? And how do they know to use it? I asked Justin Winters in a process that I've been involved in my home state in Colorado a year and a half or more ago, almost 2 years, if she could come on the phone for just a few minutes and take a look at the state of Colorado with about 40 people around the state. And we're talking about creating a regenerative recovery for our state post-COVID, when we didn't know there would be a recovery, but we thought we'd better plan for it. We zoomed in, and this is a state that thinks it has amazing wilderness values, and it does. A lot of protection, and it does. State parks, county parks, you name it, federal wilderness areas. But when you look at that map, it shows 12% of what needs to be protected is protected. And anyone in the state who cares about the state might, that's not possible. That's just not possible. Why? because we never thought of protection the way we think of it now. Your wonderful work, I believe, showed me something that we have to keep remembering is just how much awareness we need to bring into our work. All the different percentages just reflect awareness shifting. Some of it's science, some of it's always science, some of it's always learning, but most of it is just opening up our minds to see things in a different way. So when the first version of Half Earth or Nature Needs Half, my first response as a lawyer and policy and political person for my entire career who has abandoned all of that is that those names and those numbers are very negative stories. First of all, a number, as someone said last night, is cold. It has no juice. It doesn't have any dirt in it. It doesn't have people in it. It doesn't have any richness to it. It's a number. It's a policy goal, and that's what it's supposed to be. So we cannot communicate policy goals to people who are not in the world and making that policy because they don't know what you're talking about. And the first thing they think of, the first thing I thought of was, well, am I in the good half? And if I'm not in the good half, what's going to happen to my half? Well, nobody meant that. But half is half. Whose half? Which half? Where half? So there's nothing wrong with it as a policy goal, but I can tell you it's the worst possible communication narrative, right? And so I guess in my time, and I don't know how much there is or when I should stop, but the bottom line is, if we treat the substance of what we do as the only challenge, we will be doing it for a very long time. If we understand that communication is as critical, if not more so in some contexts, then we will shift the partnerships and the relationships so that our dreams and our learning shifts from that to policies, that there's another 4 or 5 steps to figure out how to communicate it, 1, and 2, that communication is not universal. Conversation with one group is not disingenuous because it's too different to a different group. It's respectful. It's recognizing that people can hear only from the point of view from which they live. And so I would invite this wonderful group of people to understand that the work we have is not just in figuring out what needs to happen on the ground and with the people who live on the ground, but with how we speak of it, both with respect and honoring that they have to do the same journey that we have already done to get to these policy goals. And they have not been in the conversation at all, anywhere in the world. Not out of disrespect, but out of head down, busy, hard, urgency. Oh God, we've got to get this done. But until we open that door and let others in a very focused, sincere, and way that isn't just about including them, but knowing that they too are going to shift this understanding, and it's not going to look the same as it looks today. Because their voices are, without them, we won't get this done, and with them, it will be different, because it has to be. So I'll just leave you with that.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much. Oh,
Okay. Thank you very much, Maddie. I was kind of like, I don't know, I have no words. I was just enthralled and I was just so focused on your speech. That was very lovely. Thank you very much.
Very sweet, so
I would like to call all of our panelists up to the stage for panel discussion, if it's possible. have one mic and we don't have a podium because it's quite expensive, you know, to have more mics. So I'm already thanking our panelists for being so patient with all these logistics. All right, so this is comfortable. The first question that I have is, let's start with Dr. Woodley.
I'm Steve.
And Steve, I always do that. Like the first email that I have with Steven is like, Dr. Woodley, would you like to be interested to be part of this panel? He's like, I'm Stephen, and I have to learn how to do that. So Stephen, hypothetical question. Let's pretend this is the last COP on biodiversity. And as the final area-based target in human history, what would you recommend?
Life is complicated. You know, we live on this magical earth, and it has more mysteries than we've begun to uncover. You know, it's challenging because there's 8 billion of us on this planet. We're going to 10 billion. And in a way, we're living in a bit of fantasy world, trying to plan for nature conservation without including that dimension, unfortunately. But it's so hard for us to talk about, we're not talking about it. This won't be the last COP. But I think the most important message is that nature conservation is occurring all over the place. I think those conversations are happening all over the
Yes,
place,
they are.
not just here. So,
Different context. But
yes. So if this COP failed, it's not the end of nature conservation. The High Ambition Coalition is still going to go on, community conservation is still going to go on, Canada's still committed to 30 by 30, there's good work going on in agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So if this fails, and I suspect it might, actually, don't want to be negative, but I suspect this might, we shouldn't go home for Christmas and be all maudlin about it, because we've generated a huge conversation, and this isn't the answer. This COP isn't the answer. It's just, it's a milestone on the way. That's how I would answer it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's like a lag with the mic, I'm sorry. But I just have a follow-up question because I guess this is very important to me because I am leading an organization for young people, and I was very hopeful that the COP would be, you know, momentous and something that's very significant to, that's gonna happen for the next 10 years. And I was imagining like our theory of change is going to be patterned to the global biodiversity framework. And right now, it doesn't look good. And I'm like, okay, now plan B. So what would you advise like young people of today, like after this COP? Because I know that a lot of people are so demotivated and disheartened. And it would be great to know, like from your perspective, you're the one in the negotiations as well. Like after this, I know you're going to the target-free negotiations. So what would you give us an advice?
I have 2 daughters, and I have these conversations with them all the time. And I mean, it's easy to feel really challenged, but we're not the first group of people to have the sort of Damocles hanging over our heads. It's been pretty common in human history, really. You could have the hordes of whatever neighboring group coming over the hills, or asteroids hitting, or plagues. You know, we haven't lived through a real plague. You know, COVID was pretty late. Yeah. So you know, we're alive, which is a miracle, and embrace that miracle. That's my advice to young people. And yes, there's huge challenges, but we're pretty good at figuring things out, and there's always hope that we'll do a good job of figuring these things out.
Can I make a comment about that?
Oh yeah, please.
There's a young woman who's a biologist, a marine biologist, who wrote a book, We Were Made for These Times. That's my answer. We aren't here by accident, and we can either whine about it, put a smile on our faces, and get to work. Whining is kind of boring.
I like that. I should put that as like a motto for.
T-shirt.
Okay, my next question is for Erin Drage. You mentioned earlier the ICCA's Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas, and this is actually a category that recognizes Indigenous land tenure and conservation values. So, in that context, is there any reason for an Indigenous community to favor OECMs over ICCAs?
Good question. No, there's not a good reason for them to favor OECMs over ICCAs. I think right off the bat, they're not in competition with each other. I think it's really important to recognize that, like I mentioned, there are a lot of OECMs that are officially accounted for within the World Database on OECMs that started as ICCAs and that continue to be ICCAs. When something is designated as an OECM, listen to me with these acronyms. It does not mean that it erases the very important designation of an Indigenous and community conserved area as well. What I think is extremely important is that OECMs legitimize, I put that in strong quotations, but legitimize these conserved areas within the system that we are operating within here at COP15, at a global scale. And I think a lot of us in here would love to see a decolonized version of global biodiversity targets, but the reality is that's not what we're working with right now. And as long as we continue to have global leaders who create targets in this structure and in this manner, we need the designations to recognize the incredibly important work that Indigenous peoples are doing to conserve their lands, and OECMs is one of those important tools that allows their efforts to be recognized at the local, national, and global scales. So no, they should not favor OECMs over ICCAs. I think it's actually quite important that ICCAs are ICCAs first, because it's this grassroots, local, community-driven initiative that OECMs should not be top-down. But an OECM designation can provide some really important benefits within the context we're working in right now.
I guess I just have a follow-up question. Because I really like your presentation. It seems like OECMs are this foolproof and also almost like a perfect concept almost. And do we still need protected areas in this way then? If everything would just say hypothetically that OECMs just like all through and never focus on protected areas anymore?
Ooh, no,
Would
we
there
still need
be need for
protected areas.
areas? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think protected areas come with, the benefit that protected areas have right now in a lot of places is really strong legislation behind them within most jurisdictions around the world. And OECMs, I would not say that they're a perfect solution, and there are a lot of parts of OECMs that are still being tested in real world applications, and protected areas are not perfect at conserving biodiversity either, but they are proven in a lot of ways, and when they're effectively managed, when they include local peoples, we know that protected areas do work, and they protect ecosystem services, they help build our climate resiliency. And so I would certainly not say that OECM should come in and take over. It's just one more tool in the tool belt.
Amazing, thank you very much. Now I have a question for Maggie. Maggie, you mentioned something about how we need to communicate this better and how we should have a narrative, not even like a better narrative, how we should have a narrative in biodiversity. I guess now we have like different languages, like scientists have different languages. I am quoting Charlotte here. Charlotte Beckwith is an ethnobotanist over here. We had a conversation just a while ago. And we talked about how there are different languages here at COP15. Languages of the indigenous peoples, the languages of the scientists, the languages of the social scientists. And it seems like we're working in silos. do you think that we can actually tackle the biodiversity crisis without compromising any of these groups
Yes.
or
I do.
systems?
Advocacy in the world has, and I've been a part of that advocacy in the world of policy and then politics, because when you think of things that need to shift in the world, you go to elected leaders to have it happen, and that involves a political process. I spent much of my career in it and thought for a really long time, embarrassingly long, that change originated in those arenas. It does not. That is where change is delivered. Change begins in culture and in conversation. And that means that all those different kinds of conversation and languages are all relevant. But we have to find a way to have commonly shared terms across all languages. And OECMs is not it. I mean, it's just too dense. It's 4 longish words, not all of which are used in all languages. So we need to be on a journey now in which we are consciously, seriously looking to create those commonly shared terms. They will best be discovered through art, through dance, through music, and through stories told by people who have lived them and lived through those experiences. And the work I seek to do, Chelsea and I and others, is to actually create a global hearth for those storytellers and do all we can to give their voices the opportunity to become universal, because their stories are universal. And they will be translated in other languages through those lenses, not by the particular artists, but by the individuals who are moved by that work. If you think about it, there's only 2 ways we all communicate without words, and that is dance, music, or really 3, art. And in our quest, as advocates, we have misunderstood that policy is the language of change. It is not. It is a tool to use for change. And the world of culture is where that conversation begins and grows and shifts and changes with a fluidity and magic that for some reason we seem to miss seeing until we are flowing in it and are moved by it, and then realize we got there not from policy conversations, but by human interaction through those genres. And that is an area that the biodiversity movement, the climate movement, the agriculture movement, there's just peeking over the horizon of. And until we move from peeking in the door to aggressively pursuing that work, because the truth is, and you all know it because you live in this world, there are literally already billions, not 8, certainly, who understand that we need a whole new relationship with this planet. But they don't even know where to find someone to quite talk about it with. And they don't have common language that they can point to, or stories or art that's expressing that in a way that they could move that through their communication channels. And yet it is everywhere. For someone like me who's been looking hard for the last 2 years, I can't get through a day or half a day without running across another version of it. My favorite thing I would share with you is a indigenous woman in the United States called Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is as close to a Bible as I ever want to see. I don't need another one. And she was just awarded by the MacArthur Foundation what they call Genius Grants. And for the first time in the history of the MacArthur Foundation, there were 2 indigenous people chosen for Genius Grants. Is change happening? Yes. Do we notice it in a room like this? No, that's not where we're looking. We're looking at negotiators and at documents, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's an incomplete picture of very incomplete picture. And yet those people who are doing that work are all in service of the work that you're doing. And yet we're not teamed up. And that is the shift that has to take place.
That
So
is,
yes, we can have a common language. We
yeah.
already do. We just don't know it, and we're not pursuing it.
That's very interesting. I still believe in like the tool and the power of policies and,
Of course.
yeah, like,
We
for
can
example,
make
like,
decisions off a piece of art,
yeah,
but you can begin to connect people to make decisions.
yes,
There has to be policy work, there has to be science. We don't just arbitrarily go, okay, this is good and this isn't. That won't work either. But you cannot find people to begin that conversation who are not scientists, who are not policy people, unless they have a reason to want that policy conversation, because they have already found an emotional reason to be involved and to realize it matters to them. Most people do not feel connected to this conversation, and yet it will impact every single human being on this planet and already is.
mhm. I guess I just have like a very small follow-up question. We speak the language of the people, but what would be the language of nature? What would nature tell us to tell, like, what would nature tell us and say, wouldn't you want to protect me? Wouldn't you want to conserve me? And I feel like that's how I want to communicate as well, that we don't just communicate with each other, but we communicate what nature needs to thrive. Because when nature thrives, so do we.
Yes.
How do you see this?
Well, we are nature. How could, of course, we have to first see ourselves. First see ourselves as who we actually are. Part of the web of life, not above it, or behind it, or around it, or on the other side, or superior to it, or separate from it. We are part of it, and we are impacting it profoundly. And until we find our place and operate from that place, then we speak for nature when we understand that we are of nature. We just don't quite get that yet in any significant way. I would say the other piece is that, this is a tender subject. So last night I heard a long conversation about human rights to nature. And I thought, how come we get them first? What is that about? What was the thinking behind that? Because the natural world does know what it needs, and we don't ask. There was a great line in the parade today: pollinators, not politicians. That was so fabulous. Or what was my favorite, Melina? What do we need for the brackets? That was
Don't bracket our future. Don't bracket our future.
no brackets in our future. I thought that one was really good. My point is, that's a pretty simple language that said a lot. And nature, well, these two, we haven't begun to listen. So it's speaking all the time. It's just we are running it through our superior brains and having it come out a bit distorted. So he's going to fix this for me. Are you going to wear a tie now?
No, I had to show you my t-shirt. I doodled this t-shirt and I sent it to my friend Mary-Eve Marchand. And you guys can see it.
See now?
So,
If you know anything,
That's art.
this is great. Bring it with you, please.
Everybody doodles.
Because that shirt, see, look, that's a picture. How many words did it take for me to say that? But look what look at that.
I didn't want to put a line through it, no words.
But that's perfect. See how simple that was communicated? A little bit of background and everyone got it. But before that, if you wore that in a store, a grocery store in Canada that hasn't been a part of this conversation, would they get it?
No, it's an
Okay.
inside joke.
Certainly inside joke.
My point is we need to have jokes that are not just inside.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And I'd like to move forward to Carl. Carl, I guess I just want to live like this, my imagination that, 50% is actually passed. And now we move forward with the implementation. I think that's what I'm really curious about. What would be the next step? for an equitable outcome of this target, because we want for nature to thrive, and based on science, it says that we only have 50% in terms of protecting, and then the others are, like some of the areas needs restoration, those are degraded. So I guess my question is kind of short about this. What would the implementation look like? What would be like the next step, and how do you envision this?
Well, I can envision, I guess I get to be creative. I mean, one of the reasons we created the Global Safety Net is because we felt like the numerical language, as you said, was inherently portional. So it felt like abstract and also kind of negative. Like, and also like, what about the other half? You know, it suddenly asks another question. So the idea for the phrase Global Safety Net was thinking through, what if we have what if we have a Paris moment for nature? And I'm a climate guy, so my whole history for the past 20 years has been focused on climate. And you know, we had the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
It was it's a success, right? But then the slog of implementation is massive. And the problem is that climate, unlike biodiversity, climate's very hard to have an emotional, I don't get like weepy when I look at a cloud, but I do when I see a sea otter holding its little baby, you know? So I feel like we have coming out of, I think I agree with Stephen that I don't think this is going to be a Paris moment for nature. I think we will have one. I do think we will have one. I don't know when it will be, but yeah, we will have one, no, for sure. And I think that when we do, we kind of have to get ready for it. And so it's not going to be, I don't want to curse it, but I don't think it's going to be now. But part of doing that will be having that visceral understanding of how an individual can then plug in, and how a company could plug in, how an investor could plug in. So for me, those are the questions I'm like really asking right now with the Global Safety Net. You know, as Maggie mentioned, in the new version, we're going to be able to, it'll be quite detailed, so you can go in and see what's my part of the Global Safety Net, and how can I help? So where are the nonprofits that are doing, like in my backyard, I have, near my backyard in Philadelphia, there's the Wissahickon Forest, which is just held together by a bunch of volunteers, and that's part of the Global Safety Net. It's actually not in the WDPA either, by the way, so to Sue's point, we gotta get it in the database. And so I think there'll be a huge, there's a public piece to it, which is working in your local area to move forward your piece of it. And then I think companies and investors are another, private sectors now coming in, as we saw also with the Paris Agreement. And it was the private sector that really pushed the Paris Agreement kind of into its adult phase. So I think we're going to see that here too, with having companies come on board.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Carl. And I really like the Global Safety Net. It took me a while to really understand, because like, I'm not the sciencey person, but it made it so easy for me like to see the map, and actually it speaks the language as well. Like it shows you where, like, which areas are the key biodiverse areas. So thank you very much for your contribution, Carl.
But yeah, one thing too, though, I think the pollinators thing made me think that we do also have to move on to the other 50, and actually one of the areas that we've gotten really interested in is suburban, how suburban folks can help in their own front yard or backyard with creating pollinator gardens. And I kind of feel like this is going to become, we had during lockdown, there was like the plant thing that happened on TikTok. All the millennials know. But like,
noble maid, like.
Yeah, and now that we don't get out of our houses, I'm trying to convert my front lawn to a pollinator meadow.
Yeah.
And of course, like I had to interview like all the scientists in my area, and it got really complicated. So we're gonna try to decomplicate that so people can start to feel like they're tangibly connecting on the other 50. And I actually think that'll help them then become advocates politically for the policy. Yeah.
That's important. I just want to close that note, like, it's important for us to know that we have a role in this movement, that shouldn't be this daunting. Shouldn't be like with all these brackets. We have our own way of like helping biodiversity, by helping nature. So thank you very much for the first set of our panelists.
Thank you.
Alright, so moving forward, is also an exciting part because to me, when we advocate for half, we also want to advocate for the increase of Indigenous land tenure. And when we talk about Indigenous land tenure, it seems like the first question to me is like, how do we do that? Like, we advocate for it, we tell everyone about it, but what are the steps to do this? Like, it varies in every country. So that's also one of the reasons why we highlight this panel, is to answer this question, because like for us as well, it's quite an overwhelming concept, like increasing Indigenous land tenure. That's why we invited someone from the tenure facility. I met Ms. Nanette Royo, she's not the one speaking today, but the executive director of tenure facility has been very active in helping Indigenous peoples increase their land tenure in different parts of the world. And today we are with Catherine Trainer, who is the program officer of the tenure facility, and she will be speaking about how they support granting throughout the project cycle of this pursuit, and including concept review, project appraisal, implementation, and evaluation. So in this part, we will talk about how, I asked specifically about the case studies, so it's easier for us to understand how they actually work at the tenure facility. So Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's quite late in Stockholm, but I really appreciate it that you're contributing to this conversation today.
All right. Thanks very much for the opportunity, and great to join you all. I wanted to refer to a comment of Carl's earlier, when he mentioned Indigenous lands are more effective at conserving and biodiversity. I'd like to add, evidence also shows that where communities have land tenure security, they're able to be even more effective. So that's why I'm going to talk about land tenure security, what it is, and different ways one can support Indigenous peoples and local communities to claim their land rights. And just for some context, research is showing that of more than 2.5 billion Indigenous peoples and local communities, and they occupy over half of the world's land area, and yet they legally own less than 10% of their territory. One way to improve Indigenous and local community land tenure is through legal mechanisms. There are countries which have laws which provide recognition for customary and community-based rights. These include Brazil, Peru, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, India, Indonesia. There can also be opportunities in other laws related to, for instance, conservation, natural resource use, agrarian reform, which can also provide space for communities to claim their tenure security. For instance, in 2019 in Panama, the Ministry of Environment took the historic step to recognize Indigenous people's land rights within protected areas. This opened up the way for about 25 territories to be able to gain recognition. And when national laws may not be a possibility, sometimes there's also opportunities at provincial and local levels for recognition of rights. An example of this is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where local communities' forestry concessions can be obtained from provincial governments. Now, do provide rights in perpetuity to communities. However, they do have to adhere to specific sustainable resource use limitations. And then I'm sure some of you will be thinking about, well, what about in countries where there aren't laws? And I mean, that's a real concern also for many communities across the globe. However, developing evidence-based claims can also be very important. Communities can use these to identify their kind of ancestral rights to land, their customary practices, which can be very valuable, and also in terms of mapping. And then just in practice, what do these processes look like? And as you can imagine, each would be unique depending on the country context, the law, the specific environment, and the communities themselves. However, there are also commonalities. And I just wanted to share some of these with you in terms of when Yen was asking about what kind of concrete steps could one take. So firstly, there's awareness raising. And if you're an outsider, please prior informed consent to engage with the community and really to raise awareness about their rights and to see if there's interest, whether they might want to go through processes to claim their land and forest tenure rights, because sometimes there are pros and cons. If there is community interest, one of the first steps is that communities need to define themselves. And there should be processes for this, for instance, community protocols. In some countries, the law actually sort of legally defines a village or a community, so that also can be another option. And then typically communities would also need to appoint their own representatives or communities who would manage the land rights claims process. And again, sometimes these actual processes or persons or representatives or sort of quotas might be defined in law. And it's very important right at the very beginning. These are also very inclusive of women. And not only that women are participating, but they really have the opportunities for meaningful participation, are able to voice their key concerns throughout the process and to make a difference in the discussions that happen. Participatory mapping is a common method to sort of conduct inventory of lands and also to map the boundaries of a community. Some of Tenure Facilities partners in Indonesia, the Indigenous Women's Wing of Amman, have developed their own engendering participatory mapping process. And this process recognises not only the role of women, but also their specific knowledge related to natural resources. And it also strives to involve 3 generations of women during the mapping process. And this supports transgenerational sharing between the women, but also within the community. And then also the men and the boys in the community also learn much more about the role of women and their specific knowledge. As you can imagine, boundaries can be a very sensitive issue, and boundaries will need to be defined not only by the communities themselves, but then they'll need to agree with their neighbouring communities on the extent of the lands which the headings claim. This could be particularly complex and also sensitive, particularly where there are sort of mobile communities such as pastoralists. Where there's seasonal variations in the extent and the use of the lands, and then also sometimes sharing of resources at different seasons. So boundary mapping can bring tensions to the surface, but it can also be an opportunity to resolve conflict. And then at some stage, if communities seeking official claims, there also needs to be adjudication, and governments will assess and decide on a formal claim to a specific land area. And many of our partners are also engaging with local administrators and local governments in terms of capacity building them, legal training, sharing knowledge, peer-to-peer learning. And so one would hope that all these different processes lead to official recognition, but this is only really the beginning, because then it's also obviously very important that right to sustain and communities' governments are supported.
Catherine, is it possible to wrap up the presentation?
We're running behind because of technical problems, so.
We're just running a little bit behind, but
Yeah,
just wrapping up.
I finished, so you can go.
Okay, great.
Right on time, thank you very much. Yeah, so that's Catherine Trainer. So Catherine, thank you very much for joining us, and it's just a little bit more for the kind of discussion bit. And now yes, thank you so much. Now I'd like to call Callie Broaddus and Mark Monteros from Reserva. Callie Broaddus is an amazing executive director of Reserva, the Youth Land Trust, and Mark Monteros is one of the leads of the Dracula Reserve, which is the first ever youth-funded, protected, or conserved areas in. We'll get there. We'll get there. Conserved areas in Ecuador. So thank you very much.
Can I get this? Okay, do you guys have I emailed you a presentation. Do you have it?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. Hello. Okay, so while they get that up, I thought we were getting a little experience at the Youth Summit earlier this week with Energizers, and I didn't really have one planned out, but I thought I would at least try to inject a little energy here. So I'm gonna need a show of hands. Does anyone here have medical training? Anyone? Any kind of medical training? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, like first aid, anything, right. Okay, great. I need 2 of you to be volunteers. No, she's just beheaded herself there. Will you volunteer? You don't have to come up. You just have to tell me your name.
Okay, Brian.
Brian?
EMT, yeah, EMT a long time ago.
Brian, former EMT. And what's your name?
Deb.
Deb. And your...
Wilderness first responder.
Me too. Nice. Okay, so Brian and Deb, we're gonna go on an imaginary journey with Brian and Deb here in Montreal. Let's imagine a wild space in Montreal. They're going on a hike together, okay? And unfortunately, Deb trips on a rock and tumbles down the hill. She tumbles through thorns, brambles, cuts up her arms pretty badly. And then there's a big drop and she falls down the drop and you hear a crack. That's not good. That crack, it was so loud that it startled a nearby moose. It freaked out and just tore you to bits and runs off. Really, you're in bad shape. Okay, so Brian, you come across Deb now, you've run down the hill, and she's covered in blood and gushing. And she's got one leg, out behind her head. What is the first thing you're gonna do?
I'm gonna look for that moose.
Okay, yeah, that's actually the correct answer. Assuming you've seen the moose run away, what's the first thing you're gonna do with Deb, who's lying on the ground, bleeding everywhere, with her leg behind her head, covered in abrasions?
I'm gonna tourniquet on her.
Exactly. You're gonna stop the bleeding.
Yeah, stop the bleeding, yep.
The planet, biodiversity, is our circulatory system. It's our life support system. And at the moment, we are bleeding out. And there are a lot of things that are wrong with us. We've got plastic pollution, we have carbon emissions going up, but we're losing our blood. It's our life support system. And I don't see that we're taking the urgency of this threat as seriously as Brian would coming across Deb bleeding out on the trail. So the place where we come in is and working with youth and kids around the world to show them how they can help stop the bleeding of our planet. It's quite a simple thing. Anyone can learn. Anyone can learn to put pressure on a wound and stop the bleeding. And I think that it's just as easy for kids and youth to learn very simply the steps they can take to help stop the loss of our biodiversity worldwide through conservation. So, does anyone know if we actually have a presentation? Yeah.
Yeah, we are doing.
Sometime. All right, cool. Well, while that comes up, I'll just introduce myself. And thank you, Brian and Deb, for your generous. I apologize for putting you through all that. Well, while this is coming up, my name is Callie Broadus. I'm the founder and executive director of Reserva, the Youth Land Trust, and I'm from Washington, D.C. I grew up on a small farm in Warrenton, Virginia, and which is quite rural. And Marco will introduce himself, and I am, I've never translated before, but I'm going to attempt to use my poor Spanish to communicate what Marco says. Si puedes introducirte.
Hola, hola. Hola, muy buenas noches. Hello, good night. I'm Marco. I'm from Ecuador. I work with the Cominga Foundation and Reserva de Youth Land Trust. And sorry, my English is not good, but Kali helped me with translate and share our experience in the cloud forest. And
Perfect.
Lo siento por no poder expresarme bien ahora. He pasado mucho tiempo en la montaña tratando de entender un poco más a la naturaleza y me olvidé de hacer mis tareas con el inglés, pero Kali me va a ayudar.
He said that he spent a lot of time in the cloud forest trying to understand nature and forgot to study English in that time. So he's got his priorities straight. If you want to take a screenshot or a picture of this, this is how you can get in touch with us. And I think we're going to shimmy along here because I know we're behind schedule. So next slide. So our organization, Reserva, the Youth Land Trust, we work to empower young people to make a measurable, to make a measurable difference for threatened species and habitats through 3 impact areas: conservation directly, education, and storytelling. And we envision a world in which young people both inherit and are able to help maintain a biodiverse planet. Okay, so we organized around a flagship project 3 years ago. We started in 2019. And the idea was to prove that young people had the financial power, whether through their own pockets or through their ability to communicate their passion and inspire others to give, the financial power to make a real difference for biodiversity loss. So we organized around this project to create the world's first entirely youth-funded nature reserve. Yeah. We partnered with 2 organizations, an Ecuadorian organization called Fundación Ecominga, and a group that I had known for a long time, Rainforest Trust, who are based in Virginia, to accomplish this. It's a 244-acre piece of tropical Andes cloud forest in Ecuador, and we finished this project last year. So with support from 4,000 youth from around the world, whether through their own donations or through a little creative project I'll tell you about in a second, we were able to complete this project. It's the expansion of a wildlife corridor because, of course, we know protected areas are better when they're bigger. So we, this piece is part of a wider network of a private protected area, and we're trying to help fill the gaps in that space. So the way we did it was mainly through a lot of little fundraisers. That's Olivia Rodrigo singing on our Instagram Live Concert for Conservation. We've got James McCulloch there with the net doing biodiversity surveys, bio blitzes for his neighbors in return for donations. It came together little by little. In fact, on the right there's Joe Wilkins, who you can see here in this chair, who ran 45 miles in one day to raise money for Reserva along the coast of Wales. So quite a number of extraordinary efforts from youth who showed that little by little we can work together and aggregate to make quite an enormous impact for nature. But when we started Reserva, knowing that what we were trying to do was demonstrate the financial power of young people and show that young people can participate in stopping the bleeding of our systems, we knew that we had to have an answer to what about those kids who don't have money? And what about those kids who don't have access to money? They don't have family or friends who can donate to their fundraisers. So we came up with this campaign. It's called the Million Letters for Nature campaign. And basically it tells kids or youth, write a letter saying what you love about nature, why it's important to you, and we'll match it with $3 toward conservation. And then we'll take your letter and we'll bring it to the UN CBD and we're gonna deliver it to negotiators for you, which is what we're gonna be doing next week. And I actually have a couple of those letters with me. So each of these letters, which Charlotte, the aforementioned ethnobotanist, actually just brought from India. And each of these protected a classroom-sized area of rainforest. That's how much $3 can protect, 500 square feet. And this is a land purchase project, so it's quite a lot of land. And I'm going to read these to you. So I apologize if this takes a minute, but I think it's really important to hear these voices. These are from 2 kids from India who are 11 years old. Dear world leaders, I know it would be funny if I said, I think I understand trees and plants. Like when I'm alone downstairs in my apartment garden, walking on the narrow path after school, then I sit on one of the benches and start talking to that big bush of bamboo or that big peepal tree next to that empty basketball court about the various excuses I should give my teacher for my incompetence and my incomplete homework example. People, do you think telling my English teacher that my cat tore up my homework, or is it too common? And it feels like the tree answers me in the way its leaves rustle or move up and down, left and right. And that feeling of losing my tree friends would be as if someone was piercing my heart. So I'd love to increase the number of trees and I'll have more friends to talk to. That's from Pally, age 11. Or this one, dear world leader, what if every human planted a tree? There'd be 8 billion trees with zillions of creatures surrounding them. I've never particularly cared for nature like my friends did, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I don't enjoy the sight of nature. I'd consider myself greedy. I say I love the sight of nature, but I don't do anything to protect it. Am I an evil person? I don't know her. She hasn't committed any sin to be waiting in line for her beheading. But why are my legs stuck to the ground instead of running to save her life? Am I an evil person? This is an 11-year-old wondering these things. And the letters that we've been receiving are a mixture of profound, comical, factual, and they're all in equal proportion an expression of young people who are seeing their world bleeding out in front of their eyes and not really knowing what to do about it. So we're very glad to be able to take their voices, bring them here, almost 4,000 of them, and also to be able to do something to help protect nature with their voices. So I think 10% of that first project, about 24 acres, was funded entirely through the matching program here. And if anyone in here is a funder, would like to help fund this program, we are always looking for matching funds to keep it going. Okay, so just to move quickly along to Marco here. So we work globally to connect young people from all around the world. We have a youth council of like 80 people from 60-something, or 20-something countries, and we work to connect them at this level to fund nature, but also down to the very base level of working to ensure young people are embedded in the conservation, exploration, research and storytelling that happens at the site. So passing it over to Marco. I know we don't have much time, so I'm gonna translate, yeah.
Nuestra reserva Drácula, digo nuestra porque es de todos ustedes también, están invitados a visitarla.
Our Dracula Reserve, and we say ours because you're all invited to be part of this.
Está ubicada en uno de los hotspots más diversos del mundo, que es los Andes tropicales, igual que su biodiversidad. También tiene un número bastante grande de endemismos.
It's located in the most biodiverse, the most endemic biodiversity hotspot in the world. Sorry, I'm gonna summarize and translate at the same time.
Tenemos en nuestra reserva algunas especies endémicas y que se encuentran también críticamente amenazadas. Sus rangos de distribución son muy locales. Muchas de estas están registradas únicamente en un par de montañas de nuestra reserva.
Yeah, most of the species that live there are extremely restricted in range. They're endemic, which means they're only living in this place, and we're able to protect them, like these two critically endangered species.
Una de las visiones que tiene la Reserva Drácula es conformar un corredor de biodiversidad que pueda unir y fortalecer sistemas de conservación para las especies amenazadas con un área de conservación llamada el Cerro Golondrinas y poder ampliar de esta manera la efectividad de conservación para muchas de estas especies.
Yeah, so Dracula Reserve is, sorry, I got a little bit lost, but Dracula Reserve is part of it's connecting two protected areas and creating a corridor to amplify the effectiveness of the work that we're doing.
Fundación Ecominga y Reserva de Joe Trust está cambiando un poquito la forma de hacer conservación e investigación en Ecuador. Estamos integrando la participación activa de los jóvenes, así como también de las comunidades, para poder efectuar nuestros trabajos en el campo y en la toma de acciones y decisiones.
Ecominga and Reserva are working together to change the way that we do research on the ground, to integrate youth researchers with local communities, working together to amplify the work of research and exploration.
Me gustaría compartirles un poquito de una experiencia que nos hizo reflexionar acerca de la vulnerabilidad que tiene este lugar.
I want to share with you a short experience about that we had that showed to us the vulnerability of this place.
Después de pasar días caminando por el bosque con un transecto que hacíamos de monitoreo,
After a few days of hiking through this forest on a research transect that we were doing to monitor endangered species,
habíamos encontrado algunas especies fascinantes, endémicas y muchas de estas también nuevas para la ciencia.
we found many endemic species as well as many that were potentially new to science.
Pero en una caminata que realicé hacia una zona que quería explorar, me encontré con el problema de la minería.
But when I was doing I was exploring a little bit in a canyon that I hoped to research, I found this evidence of illegal gold mining.
Y de pasar de un estado de felicidad y sueños, pasamos a un estado de tristeza y impotencia por ver cómo estaba cambiando y la amenaza que tiene este sector.
And I went from a state of dreams and happiness to all of a sudden feeling the sadness and the danger that we were facing here and the powerlessness.
Eso nos hizo reflexionar que las acciones que necesitamos concretar son ahora, que no tenemos mucho tiempo para poder planificar o incluso ponernos a negociar, ya que en los tiempos que nosotros invertimos en esto puede que desaparezcan ecosistemas y muchas especies.
And we don't have that much time to work. We need to work very quickly to be able to stop this from growing out of control before we lose entire ecosystems.
Hemos demostrado con Reserva y los integrantes de Fundación Ecominga que los jóvenes tenemos las capacidades para poder hacer ciencia, aportar desde diferentes campos de la investigación y también de la planificación para tomar acciones.
We've shown together with Reserva that young people can have a huge impact not only on the implementation of conservation, but much more.
Estamos conscientes que no queremos ser simplemente veedores, sino que queremos nosotros también tomar acciones para construir nuestro futuro y no esperar que trabajen por el futuro de las generaciones que vienen, sino nosotros queremos construir nuestro futuro y poder trabajar con él y aportar para él.
Basically, we don't want to wait and see our forests disappear. We want to construct our own future, and we're going to start now.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marco and Kelly. That was really beautiful. Yeah, it really shows that, you know, us youth actually have what it takes to be part of the biodiversity and nature movement. So thank you very much, Reserva. So moving forward, I would like to welcome Gwen Bridge, who is an environmental scientist and conservation advocate of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. Gwen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks to you guys, Monse. Hope you're all well. Thanks, Lyle, for inviting me here. Thanks to you guys who are doing that work. That's amazing. It's inspiring, and I think if everyone, all the youth did that kind of stuff, I would not have to sit here and talk about policy and systems change necessary to support that type of work. But I will, because that's what we're doing in the context of Indigenous conservation in British Columbia. I'll talk a little bit about the Similkameen IPCA in southern BC. There's a conservation agenda, and this will be quick, we can chat more after. There's a conservation agenda. The conservation agenda is to sort of reinvigorate Indigenous land management across their traditional territory. Their territory is relatively small in this particular instance because they've decided to focus on a constrained political and spatial geography, which is great. The conservation agenda for that whole entire area is 10-year back, mining 10-year gone, forestry 10-year gone, Indigenous management principles applied across the entire landscape. The provincial and federal government agenda is simply, we want to conserve the entire territory. We cannot do that under the current legislative and regulatory regimes. So what's happening is a phased approach which builds partnerships between federal government and provincial governments, firstly in the context of a national park reserve with Parks Canada here in Canada, and then secondly through the declaration independently of a Similkameen IPCA in another area, a pristine watershed of the Similkameen Valley. And so that is hampered by many impediments imposed by the provincial system because of the nature of the system. And I appreciate Maggie for sort of creating the segue between the science and the knowledge and the behaviors that need to shift in order for us to change. She talked about a cultural shift. And so when we do this work, and I thought deeply with some of my colleagues, including Rob Edward of Lower Similkameen, about why we behave the way we behave. Why do we behave? You know, what gives that person who comes to the meeting, who's negotiating on behalf of the province, the assumption, the belief that they have the right, their government has the right to make the decisions over the land base? Where does that belief come from, right? Why do we behave the way we behave? We behave the way we behave because of the laws that we're beholden to in our society, right? Those things, well, what are laws? Where do laws come from? Where do they come from? So we began to think, well, where do they come from, right? And in Canada, we have the context of reconciliation under the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which addressed, trying to right the wrongs around residential school systems, residential schools. So, so we started thinking, well, if we're trying to reconcile, what are we trying to reconcile? And you'll be familiar with these conversations where you go in and you're talking to people, and it's like, well, we should try and figure out whether we should save a forest, or cut it down, or pick blueberries, or drive over them and put a parking lot. These types of conversations are the types of conversations that are typically had when governments come to First Nations. Should we or shouldn't we? Dig it up, bury it, bulldoze it, cut it down, pollute it, those types of questions. Well, when they come to the meeting and the question of reconciliation is like, why are we having that conversation, right? We're having that conversation because the legislative framework under which they're operating is embodied in the assumptions they bring around the authority of humans to make decisions over the natural systems. So where does that come from, and how is it different from Indigenous systems? it comes from our Christian heritage, our Christian understanding of the world on the Western side. And I'm half English as well as satellite Cree, so I can speak to both. And so it comes from this notion of a God, right, that delegates authority for decision-making about the human's own fate. It delegates authority to humans to make decisions not only about the human's own fate, but about the fate of the animals and all of the. And so I go and read the Bible. Yes, it's true. I've got to work my way through that. But it's reaffirmed several times. Like, we hope, that God says, we hope you'll make good decisions. And there was a bit of consequence when that didn't happen, but he still delegated that authority to make the decisions about the fate of themselves and the animals to humans. Well, how does that compare to indigenous philosophy? And this is my caveat. It's based on my experience, my knowledge, my relationships. It's not pan-indigenous. If someone else got something, that's awesome. But I use the Okanagan example because they've been so grateful over the past decade and a half to share with me and share their stories and work with me. And so in that instance, the creator, so we have commonality, God and creator. In that instance, the creator creates all the animals, right, on both sides. Everyone gets created by God, everything, right, all the animals, plants, everything. And then God comes along and says, well, it's not quite done, I want to create some humans, right? And so in the case of the Okanagan and other indigenous traditions, that God says to the entities he created, the plants, the animals, the water, these kinds of things. In the case of the Okanagan, it's the 4 food chiefs, black bear, salmon, bitterroot, and Saskatoonberry. So he says to these entities, there's some humans coming, and they don't have furs or fangs, so, you know, if they're going to survive, you'll have to help them. And so luckily for the Okanagan, those animals decided to help. So God gave the authority for the determination of the fate of humans and the natural world to the animals and to the plants. So human decision-making then, and this is a summarization because of time of some of these things, human decision-making on the indigenous side is consistent with the law of the animals because that law was delegated from the creator. And so this is a bit of the challenge that we're talking about. And I use a shorthand and I have, there's lots of things within this framework, and I can talk about science and traditional knowledge and the inherent non-authority of science versus the inherent authority of traditional knowledge. But we'll talk about, well, when you're going to make a decision. So all of these things about biodiversity, should we cut it down or should we try and save species? Should we, you know, do this kind of stuff? This should we or shouldn't we is really that debate. So in the case of that shorthand for decision making on the Western side, it's such that humans get to decide the fate of the natural systems, right? So the environment is like, we want clean water. What are the decisions we need to make to get there, right? Theory of change maybe, or your planning exercises. Decision A, blah, blah, blah. Decision B, clean water, right? And the mining company's like, well, we want to, you know, satisfy our shareholders and pay taxes. So decision A, decision B, all this kind of stuff, right? So the point is there that the humans take the authority and the assumption that they get to make the decision over the system, right? On the indigenous side, since the authority was given to the animals for determining the fate of the humans, and within that process, obligations and responsibilities in that relationship were defined, and so creation and creators, you know, the animals got to say, okay, you must perform ceremony, for example, in relation to water, to keep it clean. Its authority is paramount. Your decisions get in line with that. So in that case, the natural systems, the highest authority of the land, influences human decision making, right? So you have system outcomes themselves influence human decision making. So you have an inverse relationship and assumption of decision making, which plays out in the negotiating table and all of these discussions, right? And so this is fundamentally the challenge when we try to understand reconciliation. It's not necessarily about whether there's going to be 50%, 30%, OUCM, IPCA, protected area, all of that kind of stuff, picking blueberries or cutting them down. It's about, well, the question of reconciliation and conflict resolution is how do we reconcile the fundamental conflict between these two very, very different ways of making decisions. And my point here is that both are of the highest legal order, right? Because they're delegated from the creator, right? And so those, when we're in discourse as Indigenous people, in the environments where we're in, negotiating rooms where we're here, the process of building understanding around the authority of, i.e. natural law or traditional knowledge, because all of those obligations, of course, and the authorities contained within that system are defined in traditional ecological knowledge, are defined in the way that humans have created their process of understanding the earth, right? So traditional ecological knowledge is not only a methodology of observation, analysis, conclusions, and recommendations. It's a process where you have all of that, i.e. equivalency to science, if you will, wonderful, beautiful science. I love it, I have a master's in hydrology. And so you have, well, it's a wonderful way to satisfy human curiosity, right? And so, but what you have, now I've lost my point. Sorry. So, but anyways, I'll try and wrap up now because it's becoming time. But with this, oh yeah, so indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge contains inherent legal weight. So you have the process of science, but you also have the ability for that traditional knowledge or that earth observation information, that earth truth, if you will, has the authority to influence the behavior of us as humans, right? And on the Western side, does science have legal authority to influence the way we behave on its own? No, it doesn't. What it does is provide all this wonderful information and inputs it into a policy mechanism, right? And what happens in policy? Well, we're going to get a longhand in that through this process, right? But the question that people ask is, well, we should include, and I heard you say it earlier, Maggie, we should include indigenous knowledge within policy, right? But what you're doing then is subjecting the highest level of the law around indigenous knowledge and what should happen in that process of decision-making to a system and equating it with science and then putting it into a system whereby that information is compromised by a policy validation feedback, right? And so that's a fundamental problem when you're thinking about reconciliation between indigenous nations, building understanding and thinking through the challenges that we're facing. It's not about targets, although I think we should have indigenous defined targets and all of that kind of stuff. So this is just a quick exercise in the process that we've thought through deeply on the indigenous side and the mechanisms by which to begin to create legislative and legal parity in agreements between, or for whatever topic, pick any kind of topic, right? So I think I'll just summarize rather ineloquently with saying that there is indigenous process of coming to agreement. COP is not an indigenous process of coming to agreement. There's indigenous structures of agreement. The Tsleil-Waututh have their constitution in a song. It's not written. And then there's the content of the agreement. And there needs to be indigenous content of the agreement. And our focus in meetings like these and other things is we want indigenous content in the agreement. And that's okay, but then it's subjected to the policy validation loop. So I think I'll wrap with that. There's obviously I can talk forever, literally. But thank you.
So sorry to interrupt. We are running out of time, so we'll probably have to really curtail the question and answer. Ian's been doing an excellent job, so I hate to stand up here, but there's one thing I want to say after Gwen's talk. And by the way, Mary of Marchand and Gwen Bridge are the smartest women in conservation in my book, and I could listen to them all night, so thank you, Gwen. When Nature Needs Half began in 2009, it was never primarily about the 50% target. It was primarily about transforming society's relationship with nature. And it wasn't until I met Gwen a year ago that I really began to see where the roots of that transformation had to take place in terms of the different worldviews. And I just wanted to say that really quickly. And if there's time for any questions, Yen, I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so there isn't. I'm gonna turn it over to Yen to briefly wrap up. And thank you so much for coming tonight.
This made me realize how complex this conversation really is. That 2 hours and more of this session is not enough to discuss. But what we know from this conversation is that we need nature to thrive, and it feels like we are so wrapped up with all the policies that we don't know how to prioritize what nature really needs. And I feel like I'm just gonna ramble here, so I'm just gonna close this session, but I'm really, really grateful that you all joined today and becoming part of this conversation. I hope that you guys connect and also understand more and discuss further about these issues, and that we realize that nature needs something, we need something, and I think we just have to converse and actually like learn more from each other and how like a common language to thrive for nature. So thank you so much.